My father once told me about a tradition in his village called a night with the dead. Back then, the customs of the region highly respected men and looked down on women. Women had a low status. After getting married, they often had to do heavy labor. If they didn't perform well, it was common for husbands to beat and torture them. No one had the right to interfere in another family's affairs. And of course, the woman's family didn't want that to happen to their daughter. Sometimes a woman's death was recorded by the police as a suicide, and the husband's family would face no punishment. As a result, a custom emerged in the village where, during the first 7 days after the wife died, the village youth would tie up the husband and lock him in a room with his wife's corpse for a night. If nothing happened by the next morning, it meant that the death had nothing to do with the husband, or that the deceased had forgiven him. The purpose of this custom was for the husband to endure some form of punishment to appease the wife's family. When my father was young, the sister of one of his friends got married, and a month after moving in with her husband's family, she hanged herself. With the help of some brothers, they went to the husband's village and tied him up to carry out this tradition. My father said that the husband was very adamant and stubborn, insisting that he treated his wife well, and that she had psychological issues, which led to her suicide. When the husband realized he was going to be locked in a room with his wife's corpse, panicked and begged to be released. They left him with the corpse, and if he was fine by morning, he would be freed. Before leaving, they turned off the lights and locked the door, plunging the room into darkness, with only the moonlight shining through the window. The room was completely dark, leaving only the husband and the hanging corpse. His eyes were glued to the body, and fear consumed him. In such a situation, no matter how brave the husband was, he couldn't endure it. He felt terrified, his heart pounding in his chest, holding his breath and hoping for dawn. The wife's body was covered with a white cloth, motionless. But that's when the terrifying events began. He stared at the corpse, trembling with fear. Suddenly, there was a noise from the wife's body, and the corpse in the room started to chuckle, followed by a chilling laugh. The corpse shook violently, and the white cloth tightened. The corpse slowly stood up. After a moment, the corpse stood upright, its hair covering its face, and began moving toward the husband. The corpse's feet left the ground and began to hover, as if it were hanging in midair. No matter how desperately the husband pleaded, corpse continued to approach. A pair of white teeth emerged, and a pale face appeared. Corpse's bloodshot eyes stared at the husband with what seemed like resentment. Suddenly, something even more horrifying happened. The wife's corpse's neck began to stretch. The neck elongated nearly 2 meters like a snake, reaching toward the husband. Pale, oversized face lowered straight down in front of the husband. He froze, unable to move due to the overwhelming fear. The husband was drenched in sweat, unable to utter a word, just staring at the corpse, awaiting the dreadful fate that awaited him. The wife's corpse said nothing, just growled and glared at him with an increasingly angry and ferocious expression. Suddenly, the wife opened her mouth wide and lunged at the husband. The scene was terrifying. Out of nowhere, a scream erupted, and the husband was so scared that he wet himself, begging his wife not to come any closer. The people who had locked him in were secretly peeking inside, as if they were watching a horror movie, with the husband as the main character. They didn't leave. They had set everything up to teach the husband a lesson and force him to confess what he had done that led to his wife's death. My father's friend was smugly watching the husband tremble inside. Suddenly, he froze when he heard a familiar voice from the group behind him. He turned around in shock and confusion. "Oh my God, aren't you the one pretending to be the ghost inside?" My father's friend thought that his cousin was pretending to be the ghost inside, but why was he standing outside with them? Seeing his cousin still standing outside, they were all surprised, but the cousin was even more surprised, taking off his wig and saying that the plan was to start scaring the husband half an hour later. But it was still too early. They were all puzzled and felt something was wrong. So who was pretending to be the ghost and scaring the husband inside? Cousin scratched his head and said, "How strange. Do you think it's a real ghost?" At this point, They looked at each other, realizing that if the cousin was still outside, then what they were witnessing inside was the real ghost of the wife. They were all terrified, not knowing what to do. Their bodies went cold, too afraid to move. Slowly, they looked back inside, and the sight was horrifying. The ghost's elongated neck was threatening the man inside. Looking closer, they saw that it was indeed a real ghost, and their fear reached its peak. They screamed and ran out of the yard. The next morning, they finally dared to return to check. The wife's corpse was still inside, and the husband had fainted from fear. After that, the man went mad, crying, laughing, and begging for forgiveness from his wife. The story took place at a river that flowed through my village, where many people often drowned due to the fast and deep currents. At that time, a family stood by the riverbank, all of them with sorrowful expressions, looking down at the water and lamenting. The reason was that their son had drowned while swimming in the river, so they sought the help of Mr. Kong, a man known for retrieving bodies from the river. As hours passed without any results, the family grew increasingly anxious. Suddenly, at that very moment, the man pointed to the water and shouted loudly, "Come back! Come back!" With eyes full of hope, 3 family members looked down at the river and saw Mr. Kong in his wooden boat. Mr. Kong, with a weathered and simple face, was both a boatman on the river and a body retriever. The victim's family anxiously waited as Mr. Kong's wooden boat slowly approached the shore. The river was rising at that time, causing the boat to sway, and Mr. Kong had to carefully maneuver to prevent it from capsizing. Soon after, Mr. Kong quickly rowed towards the shore. As his boat docked, the 3 family members looked into the wooden boat with worry, and the mother's face was filled with sadness. There was nothing in the boat except for a fishing net. Tears streaming down her face, the mother asked Mr. Kang if he could retrieve her son's body, her voice choked with grief. Mr. Kang did not respond. Instead, he silently raised his wrist, which had a rope tied around it. He let one end of the rope drop into the water, while the other end seemed to be tied to something heavy that he was trying to pull up. Mr. Kang's face grew more somber and contemplative. Still didn't utter a word, his eyes fixed on the water below. As Mr. Kang pulled the rope from the water, a pale white hand of the dead body emerged, shocking everyone present. It turned out that Mr. Kang had tied the body to the rope and was pulling it ashore. According to local beliefs, it was considered bad luck to place a drowned body on the boat. Mr. Kang quietly pulled the body onto the shore, then turned his back and returned to his boat. When the mother witnessed the heartbreaking scene before her, she collapsed, crying out and wailing as she saw her son's lifeless body. Mr. Kang was all too familiar with such scenes, and he calmly rowed away. Just as Mr. Kang's boat was about to leave, a man ran up and called out to him, "Mr. Kang, wait!" The man handed Mr. Kang a large sum of money to thank him for retrieving their son's body. However, Mr. Kang refused the money and rowed away, saying, "I don't do this for the money. Take care of your son's final rights. I'm leaving now." Mr. Kang didn't despise others, but a painful event from the past had changed his outlook. In the past, Mr. Kang used to row his boat and fish on the river. And if he encountered a floating corpse, he would retrieve it to earn some extra money. The story took place 5 years ago. When Mr. Kang discovered the body of a victim, instead of handing it over to the family immediately, he made them kneel on the riverbank. The poor couple didn't have enough money to pay Mr. Kang, so they begged him to lower the price so they could retrieve their child's body. Mr. Kang thought for a moment, then lowered the price, but it was still too high for the poor family to afford. The elderly woman cried out, pleading with Mr. Kang to show mercy and reduce the fee further. In that desperate situation, the old man wept and said, "I beg you, sir, we'll pay you a little now, and we'll borrow the rest to pay you later." After speaking, the elderly couple continued to bow their heads in supplication to Mr. Kang, who still held the rope tied to their son's body, contemplating the old man's plea. Finally, Mr. Kang agreed to take the money and handed over the body to the grieving parents so they could take it home. Mr. Khan's wife had passed away early, leaving only his daughter, who was married. Concerned that her father might be lonely, his daughter often visited him on weekends, taking the time to cook delicious meals for him. That day, with a considerable amount of money in hand, Mr. Khan cheerfully bought some wine and meat, preparing for a good meal with his beloved daughter. He handed her a large piece of meat and asked her to make a stew. Mr. Khan's daughter was now his only source of comfort, and he was delighted that she still regularly visited and cooked for him. In the past, his daughter had disapproved of him drinking, but today she not only cooked a tasty meal but also bought her father a fine bottle of wine. As they ate dinner together, father and daughter shared many interesting stories. Then Mr. Khan, deep in thought, asked his daughter, "Is there something you want to say to me?" His daughter responded that she was happy he was always healthy and content, but there was something she had always kept in her heart. It turned out that she had long opposed her father's job of retrieving bodies for payment. The villagers had said that Mr. Khan was dishonest, exploiting a grim task to make money. Mr. Khan looked up before his daughter could finish speaking. He had heard the whispers behind his back about this before, but now even his daughter disapproved of his work. After losing his wife early, he had to do everything to support his daughter. Mr. Khan didn't care what others said, but hearing his daughter express such sentiments filled him with disappointment. He immediately stood up, angry, and scolded his daughter for not understanding him. Mr. Khan stormed out, not looking back even as his daughter called after him. At that moment, Mr. Khan was deeply distressed, feeling that even his daughter looked down on him. He had barely taken a few steps outside when it began to rain. He felt as if the world itself was against him. Mr. Khan walked back to the small shed by the river where he often rested. He lay down inside, soaked to the skin, curling up to show how cold and sad he was. He couldn't stop crying as he thought about everything that had happened and the bitterness he had endured. The rain kept pouring, and Mr. Khan didn't know when he fell asleep. Suddenly, he faintly heard the sound of rain outside the shed mixed with the voice of his daughter calling him. He jumped up and looked outside, where he saw his daughter standing in the rain, calling out to him. Forgetting his anger, Mr. Khan rushed out of the shed, worried his daughter might catch a cold as she stood there drenched. Mr. Khan looked at his daughter standing in the rain, and a surge of pain welled up in his heart. But there was something strange about her behavior. She begged him to forgive her for what she had said earlier, and then she told him she had to leave, coming to see him one last time. Mr. Khan was puzzled, not understanding where his daughter planned to go with those words. He hesitated, and in that moment, his daughter turned and walked toward the river. He rushed forward to stop her, but to his shock, his hand passed right through his daughter's body. His hands trembled as he stood there, frozen, calling her name in vain. An unsettling feeling told him that his daughter had met with an accident and was trying to return to see him one last time. Mr. Khan sorrowfully called out her name, but there was no response. His daughter continued walking toward the cold river. The heart-wrenching cries of the father were drowned out by the sound of the rain, making the pain of losing his daughter unbearable. From the moment Mr. Khan left the house, his daughter had been searching for him along the riverbank, but she tragically slipped and fell into the river, drowning. Ever since that day, Mr. Khan has rowed his boat on the river, retrieving the bodies of the dead without accepting any payment. In December 1989, an event occurred in the northern area of Hong Kong, a region of the New Territory. There was an old restaurant specializing in delicious dishes, but it mainly served rice and pho. One day, Shang, a young man working at the restaurant, received an order for 4 people, including pho and grilled meat with egg. The address is C, Building B, Garden Plaza, right? Alright, I'll deliver it right away. Shang immediately grabbed a pen and notebook to jot down the address and went to deliver the food. The address wasn't hard to find, though Shang didn't spend too much time searching. It was an old building, cold and seemingly unoccupied for a long time. Upon arrival, Shang rang the doorbell. A strong gust of wind made him shiver. The doorbell rang for a long time, without anyone opening. Posters scattered outside suggested that the house had been abandoned for a while. Shang rang the doorbell multiple times. No one answered or opened the door. Shang wondered if he had written the address incorrectly, and thinking he might have been deceived, he prepared to return to the restaurant. But as he turned to leave, a voice came from inside. Sounded like someone was trying to open the door. Shang thought he heard a voice but couldn't make it out clearly. The door suddenly creaked open, accompanied by a terrifying noise that made Shang anxious. The door opened only a small crack, but the inside was so dark, Shang couldn't see anything. The person inside spoke in a hoarse voice and opened the door just a little, as if no one was allowed to look inside. The person then passed a bill through the crack in the door. The hand was strange. Although the person only opened the door a little and placed the money outside, Shang couldn't see the person's shape. It seemed to be a man. Shang examined the bill carefully, finding nothing wrong. Shang thought it was odd that the man requested him to leave the food at the door. That night, while the restaurant was closing and the owner was checking the day's income and expenses, he noticed something strange. He discovered a strange piece of paper among the real bills. He didn't know where it came from, but it annoyed him. He yelled at the staff. Who did this? Why is there fake money here? He suspected that the real money had been replaced with fake bills. Tried to speak loudly to prevent the staff from doing it again, but he was furious and threw the fake bill in the trash. The next day, an order from that address came again, requesting the same food as the day before. Owner confirmed the order immediately and asked Shang to continue the delivery. However, the delivery situation was the same as before. The money was still passed through the crack in the door, and the food was still requested to be left at the door. People inside still refused to show themselves. That night, the same thing happened again with a fake bill among the real money. Who did this? You think I'm a fool? The owner's voice continued to shout. Seeing the boss angry, Shang informed him about the unusual delivery to that address. After some thought, the owner concluded that if the residents of that house continued to order from the restaurant, he would find out the truth. The next day, as predicted, there was another order from that address. The owner personally delivered the food to the location and received the money through the crack in the door. He took the money and examined it carefully, flipping it over and over, but saw nothing suspicious. The owner, like Shang, left the food at the door, hurriedly took the money and left, his face now filled with contemplation and confusion. Back at the restaurant, he set the money aside to observe if anything unusual occurred, to avoid misunderstandings like the previous 2 times. After completing other income calculations, he glanced at the money in the evening and was shocked. The incident scared him so much that he dropped his cigarettes and his mouth opened wide as if witnessing something horrifying. The money, which seemed normal, had turned into fake bills again. The owner, terrified and unable to believe his eyes, immediately called the police, his voice trembling. Police, it's me. Something terrible has happened. Please come here as soon as possible. According to the owner, the police hurried to the scene, but found the doorbell completely broken and no one opening the door. Police had to use force to break in. However, upon entering, they discovered the door locked from the inside. The horrifying scene before them frightened everyone. There were 4 dead bodies lying on the floor. These people had been dead for a long time. Their bodies had shriveled to bones and the flesh had decomposed. Based on the scene, they likely used a coal heater in the room to keep warm, but ultimately inhaled toxic fumes. Because these people lived in isolation and had no social interactions, no one discovered their bodies. What was strange was the empty food containers scattered around the room, which puzzled the police. Since everyone in the room was dead, who had eaten the food? The corpses were discovered and sent to the morgue for forensic examination, which confirmed they had been dead for over a month. But the food in their stomachs was only 2 days old. The results shocked the entire police force. The dead person's fingerprints were also found on the fake bills from the restaurant owner. As soon as this bizarre event spread and was reported by the media, it became a mystery the police could not solve. It became the most mysterious case the Hong Kong police in decade. According to a feng shui master, the souls of the deceased could not leave the building where the incident occurred due to the lack of sunlight, so they felt as if they were still alive. And sometimes people could still hear them talking in the room, moaning, and occasionally eerie giggles. The echoing pines. There's something about Pine Hollow that draws people in. It's not the beauty of the trees or the serenity of the forest. It's something deeper, something that calls to the darkest parts of your mind. I moved to the small town near Pine Hollow after my wife Claire passed away. I needed a place to escape, somewhere quiet where I could be alone with my thoughts. The townsfolk warned me to stay away from the forest, but I didn't listen. I didn't believe in their stories of people who went in and never came back. I thought it was just a local legend, a way to keep outsiders away. For the first few weeks, I stuck to the outskirts, hiking the well-worn trails during the day. The forest was peaceful, a sanctuary from my grief. But the more I walked those paths, the more I felt it. The pull of the deeper woods, parts untouched by time. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, constant, nagging feeling that there was something more out there, something I needed to find. I became obsessed. My dreams were filled with images of twisted trees and shadowed paths, something just out of sight waiting for me. It started to consume me. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. All I could think about was the forest, the secrets it held, and the feeling that whatever was out there was calling to me. One day, I couldn't resist anymore. I packed a bag, took a compass, and set off into the woods. I told myself it was just another hike. I'd turn back before it got dark. But deep down, I knew I wasn't coming back. Not until I found whatever it was that haunted my dreams. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. Air grew heavy, the light dimmed, and the trees closed in around me. The compass became useless, the needle spinning wildly, and the trail disappeared beneath a carpet of pine needles. But I didn't care. I kept going, driven by something I couldn't explain. Hours passed, or maybe days. It was impossible to tell. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, as if it was alive, breathing, watching. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. But every so often, I would hear it, an echo, a voice that wasn't my own, whispering my name. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of things I'd buried deep inside, my guilt, my regrets, the pain of losing Claire. They knew things about me that no one else could, things I didn't even admit to myself. And the more I listened, the more I realized that the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. I began to see things, glimpses of Claire, her face twisted in agony, calling out to me. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision, and the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I knew I was losing my mind, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going, had to find whatever it was that called to me. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient pine, bark blackened and twisted, as if it had been struck by lightning. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, telling me to come closer, touch the tree. I stepped forward, my hand outstretched, and as soon as my fingers brushed the bark, everything went silent. Forest, the whispers, even my own thoughts, all of it was swallowed by an overwhelming darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the tree was draining the life out of me, pulling me into its twisted roots. And then, in the darkness, I saw her, Claire, standing just beyond the tree, her eyes hollow, face gaunt. She reached out to me, her lips forming words I couldn't hear. But I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to join her, to be with her again. I took a step forward, but something held me back. Part of me, buried deep beneath the obsession and the madness, fought against it. This wasn't Claire. It was something else, something that had taken her form, feeding on my guilt and grief. I tried to pull away, but the tree wouldn't let go. The roots wrapped around my legs, the bark pressing against my skin, and I felt it, the hunger, the need to consume, to devour my very soul. I screamed, sound ripping through the silence, and for a brief moment I broke free. I ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. forest blurred around me, the shadows chasing me, the whispers now angry, furious that I had escaped. I don't know how I made it out. One moment I was running through the darkness, and the next, I was at the edge of the forest, the sun rising over the horizon. But something wasn't right. The town looked different, older, decayed. People who found me were strangers, their clothes worn and their faces haggard. They told me I'd been missing for years, that I was the last of many who had gone into Pine Hollow and never returned. But I knew the truth. I hadn't escaped. Not really. The forest still has a hold on me, its roots deep in my mind. I can feel it, even now. The whispers are still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. I can't sleep, can't think, can't escape the feeling that I'm still in that forest, still lost among the trees. And one day, I know I'll go back. I'll return to Pine Hollow, to that ancient tree, and this time I won't be able to resist. Because the forest doesn't just want you to visit, it wants you to stay. Forever. The Whispering Pines. In the small, forgotten village of Pine Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, life moved at a slow, steady pace. The village was surrounded by dense, ancient woods known as the Whispering Pines, a place that the locals spoke of only in hushed tones. The trees were tall, their branches twisted, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. It was said that the forest whispered secrets, drawing in those who dared to listen too closely. Jacob, a 16-year-old boy with a curious mind and a love for the outdoors, always been fascinated by the Whispering Pines. His mother often warned him to stay away from the deeper parts of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the light barely penetrated. But Jacob couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. He would spend hours wandering the edges of the forest, his imagination running wild as he imagined what lay beyond. One crisp autumn morning, the village was shaken by a horrific discovery. The lifeless body of Emily, a 17-year-old girl from the village, was found hanging from a tree deep within the Whispering Pines. The sight of her pale, still form swaying in the cold breeze sent a shiver through the hearts of everyone who saw it. The villagers were quick to label it a suicide, tragic end to a troubled girl. But Jacob knew better. Emily had been full of life, always smiling, her laughter echoing through the village. The thought that she would take her own life didn't sit right with him. As the days passed, Jacob found himself unable to shake the image of Emily's lifeless body. It haunted his dreams, her vacant eyes staring back at him, pleading for help. He couldn't understand why, but he felt a deep connection to her, the need to uncover the truth. Forest, once a place of wonder, now felt sinister, as if it held a dark secret, just waiting to be discovered. Against his mother's warnings, Jacob began to venture deeper into the Whispering Pines. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering his name in a language he couldn't understand. He spent hours searching, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to Emily. But the forest was a maze, and no matter how far he walked, he always ended up back where he started. His obsession grew, consuming him. He could no longer focus on anything else. All he could think about was Emily and the dark, twisted trees that had taken her life. The villagers began to notice his strange behavior, whispering that the forest had claimed another soul, that Jacob was losing his mind. But he didn't care. He knew that he had to find the truth, no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in an eerie twilight, Jacob stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, hidden among the roots of an ancient tree, was a small, leather-bound journal. He recognized it immediately. It was Emily's. His hands trembled as he opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with her neat, looping handwriting. But as he read, his heart sank. The journal was filled with entries about the forest, about how Emily had felt it calling to her, how she couldn't escape its pull. She wrote about the whispers, about how they had started out soft, almost comforting, but had grown louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. She wrote about a man, a shadowy figure who appeared in her dreams, his voice smooth and comforting, urging her to come deeper into the woods. But the final entry was what truly terrified Jacob. Emily had written that she had seen the man in the village, that he was someone she knew, someone everyone knew. She didn't name him, but the fear in her words was palpable. She wrote that she was going to confront him, to demand answers, but she never got the chance. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had just read. The man in Emily's dreams wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He was real, and he was in the village. But who was he? And why had he led Emily to her death? As Jacob turned to leave the forest, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The forest was silent, the whispers gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Jacob returned to the village, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. He knew he had to find the man Emily had written about, to confront him and make him pay for what he had done. But as he walked through the village, he noticed something strange. The villagers were watching him, their eyes cold and distant, as if they knew something he didn't. That night, as he lay in bed, Jacob couldn't sleep. The journal sat on his bedside table, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the village. He tried to push the thoughts from his mind, but the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in his ears. "Jacob?" The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He knew that voice. It was the same voice Emily had written about in her journal. Voice of the man who had led her to her death. With a growing sense of dread, Jacob got out of bed and made his way to the window. The village was dark, the only light coming from the full moon that hung high in the sky. But as he looked out, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. Tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The man smiled, cold, cruel smile that sent a wave of terror through Jacob's body. "You're next," the man whispered, voice carrying on the wind. Jacob stumbled back, his heart racing. He knew then that he couldn't stay in the village, that he had to leave before it was too late. But as he turned to grab the journal, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Written across the pages in Emily's handwriting were the words, "He's one of them. Run." Jacob's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The villagers, they were all part of it, part of the forest, part of whatever dark force had claimed Emily's life. And now they were coming for it. In a blind panic, Jacob grabbed the journal and fled from his house, running through the dark, empty streets of the village. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. Run! He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs could carry him no further. But no matter how far he went, whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, he reached the edge of the forest, the trees towering over him like ancient sentinels. He knew he shouldn't go in. The forest was dangerous, but he had no choice. The village was no longer safe. As he stepped into the forest, the whispers grew quiet, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. Trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. But he kept going, driven by a need to escape, to survive. But the further he went, the more he realized the truth. There was no escape. Forest had claimed Emily, and now it was claiming him. The villagers, the man in the shadows, they were all part of it, part of the dark force that lived within the trees. And as Jacob stood there, alone in the darkness, he finally understood the true horror of the Whispering Pine. It wasn't just a forest, it was alive, feeding on the fear and despair of those who wandered too deep. The last thing Jacob heard before the darkness swallowed him was a soft, almost comforting whisper. "Welcome home." And then, it's nothing. The Hollow Men. Deep in the heart of America's rural Midwest lies the small, unassuming village of Stillwater. The village had always been peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The townsfolk knew each other by name, and everyone shared a sense of community, bond forged by years of quiet living. The only shadow in their lives was the vast, looming forest that bordered the village. The locals called it Blackwood, a place shrouded in superstition and dread. No one dared to venture too far into Blackwood, for the stories of those who had disappeared within its depths were enough to keep even the bravest souls away. One summer evening, a family of 3 arrived in Stillwater. They introduced themselves as the Harpers, John, the father, Mary, the mother, and their teenage son, Peter. The Harpers were an odd trio, their arrival stirring whispers among the villagers. They moved into an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts, right on the edge of Blackwood. The house had been abandoned for years, and its new occupants did little to improve its condition. Instead, they seemed content to live in its decaying walls, isolated from the rest of the village. John was a tall, imposing man with a cold demeanor. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were clipped and emotionless. Mary, on the other hand, was eerily cheerful, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She often wandered through the village, humming old tunes under her breath, her presence unsettling to those who crossed her path. Peter was a quiet boy, always lurking in the background, his dark eyes observing everything with a disconcerting intensity. Strange things began to happen soon after the Harpers settled in. Livestock went missing, leaving no trace but disturbed earth and broken fences. The village's crops, usually abundant, began to wither and die without explanation. At night, the villagers reported hearing strange noises coming from Blackwood. The sound of distant chanting, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, and the occasional, faint glow of firelight deep within the trees. As the weeks passed, the villagers grew increasingly uneasy. Children spoke of seeing shadowy figures at the edge of the forest, watching them with hollow eyes. The local preacher, Father Harris, warned the villagers to stay away from the Harpers, claiming they were harbingers of something evil. His warnings were dismissed at first. The unease in Stillwater continued to grow. One night, a young girl named Emily went missing. She had been playing near the forest, and when she didn't return home, her frantic parents organized a search party. The entire village joined in, scouring the woods and the surrounding fields, but Emily was nowhere to be found. The villagers were on edge, their fear palpable. Whispers spread that the Harpers had something to do with her disappearance. Father Harris decided to confront the Harpers. Armed with a sense of righteous fury, he marched to their farmhouse, villagers following at a distance. John answered the door, his expression impassive as the preacher accused him of dark deeds and demanded to know where Emily was. John's response was chilling. "The forest takes what it's owed," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We have nothing to do with it." Father Harris refused to back down. He insisted on searching the house, but John stood firm, his cold eyes daring the preacher to challenge him. The standoff continued until Mary appeared, placing a hand on John's arm. "Let them search," she said softly, her smile unsettling in its calmness. "They won't find anything." The villagers searched the farmhouse from top to bottom, but as Mary had said, there was no sign of Emily. The Harpers watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. The villagers left the house with their fear now mixed with confusion and doubt. The uneasy feeling in Stillwater only deepened. The night after the search, Father Harris disappeared. His house was found empty, the door wide open, and his Bible lying on the floor, pages torn and scattered. Panic gripped the village. The once tight-knit community began to unravel, suspicion and fear driving a wedge between neighbors. As more villagers vanished, always without a trace, the remaining townsfolk became desperate. They accused one another of harboring dark secrets, of being in league with whatever evil had befallen their village. The Harpers, meanwhile, continued to live quietly on the edge of Blackwood, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around them. One particularly brave villager, a man named Thomas, decided to take matters into his own hands. He had lost his wife and son to the darkness creeping over Stillwater, and he was determined to find out the truth. Late one night, armed with a rifle, Thomas sneaked into the Harpers' farmhouse. He crept through the silent halls until he found a hidden door leading to the basement. What he found there was beyond his worst nightmares. The basement was a shrine to death and madness. The walls were lined with photographs of the missing villagers, their faces twisted in terror. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in dried blood and adorned with strange symbols. But it was the discovery of the Harpers' true identities that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Hidden among the relics of horror were newspaper clippings detailing the grisly murders of a family by the name of Harper, crime that had occurred hundreds of miles away, years before. The Harpers had been murdered, their killers never found. People now living in the farmhouse weren't the Harpers at all, but the very murderers who had stolen their identities. They had moved from town to town, leaving a trail of death and despair in their wake, each time assuming the identities of their victims to start anew. As Thomas realized the horrifying truth, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see John, Mary, and Peter standing at the top of the stairs, their faces cold and devoid of humanity. John spoke in a voice that chilled Thomas to the core. "You've seen too much," he said, "and now you'll join the others." The next morning, the villagers found Thomas's house empty, belongings untouched. The Harpers were gone too, their farmhouse abandoned and lifeless. The village of Stillwater was left in a state of quiet horror, the missing never found, and the truth of what had happened only known to a few. In the years that followed, the legend of the Hollow Men spread through the region, a tale of a family that wasn't a family at all. Murderers who changed their faces like one might change clothes, moving from place to place, leaving destruction in their wake. They say that if you hear strange noises coming from the forest, or if new neighbors move in at the edge of town, you should be very, very careful. Because the Hollow Men are always looking for their next victims, always ready to assume new identities and start their deadly game all over again. And somewhere in a small, quiet village, not unlike Stillwater, the Hollow Men are already among them, their true nature hidden behind cold, lifeless eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again.